So let me add my thanks to Melon, who make these events possible, and to Crash and its incredibly helpful staff, and also to the director, to Simon. Just add in footnote, I was saddened that two of Simon's other collaborators in this Melon project couldn't make it over here. So if you're watching, Jim and Tony, hi. On Monday, June the 5th, 1963, Frederick Ernest was admitted to the clinic of Dr. Harmer, a consultant of geriatrics at the Tavistock. Over the previous 3 months, Frederick's family had become increasingly concerned about him. It all began in early April, a Thursday, when the 65-year-old former High Street bank manager had erupted in uncharacteristic anger. For the most part, his anger had been directed forcefully at his son, Martin, who had followed his father into the banking business and was at that time working in the mortgage division of Barclays Bank. The night before the incident, Frederick had dined at his son's house, a short walk away from the family home he now lived in alone since the death of his wife 2 years previously. Over dessert, Martin unusually had launched rather loosely into a conversation about a client who was applying for a mortgage. The application was, at least to him, a little tricky, and he thought his father might have some advice. The conversation between father and son, again unusually, became very unfocused because Frederick repeatedly asked, "But what do they want the money for?" At first Martin answered in the obvious way, to purchase a property, of course. But when his father asked again, perhaps for the 6th or 7th time, he realized that answering this way would not satisfy the query. Furthermore, his father was getting increasingly agitated by the conversation, so he switched topic and asked him about the state of the early spring family garden. An hour or so later, he walked his father home, and on saying good night, he indicated that he would call by in the morning before getting the train to work, pretending that he had some good reason for doing so. In truth, he was concerned that his father was not as mentally sharp as he knew him to be. A worried thought had crossed his mind. Perhaps his father had suffered a minor stroke. The next morning, accompanied by Miranda, he knocked on the door of the family home and was greeted by a very unusual sight. His father still in his nightgown, dishevelled and drawn-looking. Martin's worries were naturally increased immediately. His attempts to ascertain if anything had happened in the night, or if there was any particular reason for his father's manifest agitation, only increased the temperature of their exchanges. Martin was also deeply perplexed by his father's continuous reference to having lost something. "What have you lost, Dad?" he asked more than once, and on each occasion his father simply replied, "I've lost it. Don't you see? Last night, over dinner, I've lost it." Over the next few weeks, Martin and Miranda took especial care to call by the house to check on Frederick. They began to notice strange anomalies to his customary well-ordered life. On one occasion, using the downstairs lavatory, Martin noticed that there was no soap in the soap dish by the basin. A few days later, he noticed there was no lavatory paper. By the end of the second week in April, when he picked his father up to take him for their weekly Sunday walk, he felt that there was a strange and unfamiliar feel to the house. It seemed as if there was something being depleted in the atmosphere. Mindful that the initial agitation had been caused by inquiring as to what his father had lost, Martin had refrained from asking if he had recovered the object for over a week, but on this occasion he casually said, "I'm glad you must have found what you lost," to which his father replied, "No, son, it's gone for good." By mid-May, the sense of depletion in the house now had a very obvious cause. It was clear that his father had not been shopping for some while. There was nothing in the fridge, only the most infrequently used store cupboard basics left. Martin became, understandably, very concerned, and suspected that his father was, for some reason completely unintelligible to him, winding down his life. It was clear that some medical help was required. Their first thought was to contact the local GP who had known the family for nearly 40 years. Dr. Marshall, in his very casual style, called by the house at the end of surgery one day, and spent a good hour or so with a patient he had known almost as long as he had practiced medicine. The next day he reported back to Martin that although it was manifestly the case that his father was not feeding himself properly, there was no reason that he could ascertain for this behaviour. He also observed that as far as he could tell, his father was in good health, and apart from some reference to having lost something that remained undisclosed, there seemed to be nothing of any serious nature wrong with his mind. By late May, things had not improved, but, truth to tell, neither had they become significantly worse. Martin and Miranda had taken to giving Frederick food and supplies, and often invited him to share their family meal. Since his father was comfortably off, having retired on a very respectable pension, Martin was bemused as to why he seemed to be refusing to replenish supplies. Any mention of this always elicited the same response: "It's no good, I've simply lost it." At this point, sometime around the last week of May, Martin began to think that perhaps more specialised investigations might be appropriate, so he asked the family GP to refer his father to someone who might be able to provide an expert opinion. Dr. Marshall was happy to oblige, and set up a consultation at the Tavistock with a friend of his who had a close interest in diseases of ageing. The consultation duly took place in early June, and Martin and Miranda nervously awaited some news. Frederick was much as before, perfectly at ease and to all intents and purposes healthy in both body and mind, apart from the curious reluctance to maintain his household with the necessary goods. On June the 15th, Dr. Marshall called around to Martin's house to pass on the information that he had received from the consultant early that morning. The consultant of the Tavistock had written a long and detailed letter in which he outlined the reasons for thinking that Frederick was suffering from a rare form of ageing. He was, apparently, losing his concepts. And the good evidence for what was almost certainly a degenerative condition was that he had lost the concept of money. What is it to possess concepts such that one might be able to make some sense of the thought that one could lose them? I begin here because the most powerful contemporary account of conceptuality, that to be found in cognitive science, has a very straightforward way of answering the question. It would reply, losing your concepts is tantamount to losing your words. This is because, according to cognitive science, I am said to possess a concept when I use a lexical item in a natural language correctly. This leads some cognitive scientists to make assertions about the ontology of concepts, claiming that concepts are the meaning of the words that designate them. I do not want to imply that this is the end of the matter. In point of fact, cognitive science stages a pretty robust debate about how conceptuality might be modelled, with Jerry Fodor out on one limb setting off large-scale explosions designed to destroy the so-called classical account, and critics of Fodor, like Susan Carey, on the other, defending that account, at least in some of its salient features. I'm not now concerned about how one might negotiate these different views, since I wish merely to note two aspects of this contemporary way of thinking concepts that are commonly taken to be uncontroversial. The first is the concatenation of words and concepts. Given that cognitive science is only rarely comfortable with what are termed lexical concepts, it is perhaps unsurprising that for all intents and purposes, concepts are taken to be identical to words, although here one should note that Fodor's stress on complexity and what he calls compositionality moves away from a focus on simple lexical concepts. In this paper, I'm going to take a different view, since it seems to me that if we are to make much headway with the brief I have been given, understanding through concepts, it will be advantageous to keep words apart from concepts for as long as we can. This, anyway, will be my strategy. The second thing I want to take away from cognitive science is the assumption that concepts are mental entities. It seems likely that one would end up with a rather odd account of concepts if one denied this categorically. But in saying that concepts are items or features of mentation, of cognitive processing or thinking, one need not consider them as exclusively so. This is to note that something may be gained by trying to understand how concepts are also cultural and social entities. And of course this implies that they have historical extension, though it does not necessarily imply that all concepts, or even very many, are chronovariant. If we might profitably consider concepts to be cultural as well as mental entities, there may be something to be gained by describing them as lived with forms of understanding. This, of course, puts some pressure on what it might be to live with a form of understanding, but I'm going to leave that hanging for a while. My opening, let me call it a conceptual fiction, is in part designed to aerate the thought so that one might begin to see how losing one's concepts makes a certain kind of sense. And I mean to activate the ambiguity or pun here. I do mean to imply that a loss of concepts need not also lead to a loss of understanding. That is, such a loss may involve making a different kind of sense. All this, of course, immediately asks us to consider who or what might possess concepts, or under which circumstances concepts might be said to be items of property. In the scenario I made up, I want to suggest that my protagonist, Frederick, had not lost the meaning of the word money, but mislaid the part of his lived experience, his living with the concept money, that enabled him to understand how to purchase goods. I chose this concept because, as perhaps many of you know, one of the standard tests for degenerative aging diseases is to ascertain if the patient has confusion over handling money. This prompts me to remark a second, albeit rather speculative dimension to my opening gambit. Essentially, I want to propose in a very inexpert way the following thought. When we test our aging relatives for degenerative conditions, say Alzheimer's disease, we try to ascertain if they are experiencing a loss of memory. The first question, for example, in the diagnostic tool widely used called the Alzheimer's questionnaire is this: does the patient have memory loss? My inexpert query is this: what if our aging process does not only comprise a loss of memory, but also a depletion of our conceptual storehouse? Do we conflate a loss of our ability to remember with a loss of something different, a depletion of our conceptual toolbox, or a diminishment in the flexibility by which certain concepts might be applied, say a hardening of our concepts like the hardening of the arteries? What if we adjust our senses of degenerative age-related conditions so as to understand them in part as the consequence of our no longer being able or even wishing to live with certain concepts? I don't want you to imagine that I'm dabbling in areas here for which I have no expertise, let alone credentials. My purpose in raising this speculation is to shake out how I conceptualize conceptuality. As you can see from what I just proposed as ways of thinking about aging, each of my locutions conveying the diminishment of a conceptual habitus implies something slightly different about the nature of a concept. It's that I mean to explore. You can get its measure by also attending to this notion of loss. Is this loss something like mislaying a concept? Or is it more like the wiping of a hard disk, not temporary loss, but definitive? If the former, it implies that one might be able to recover one's mislaid concepts, and that clearly has an intriguing consequence with respect to the clinical condition of aging. It suggests that one might benefit from an attempt to conceptualize degenerative mental conditions in slightly different ways than we currently do, which essentially see the depletion or degradation of memory as perhaps not the single but certainly one of the most important causes of such conditions. The reason why this intrigues me is related to a remark I made a moment ago about the non-coincidence of words and concepts. This will have more traction by the time I reach the end of my presentation. I'm going to hang for a moment longer in another anecdotal excursus. I'm sure that almost everyone in the room will recognize its descriptive envelope. In her late 60s, my grandmother began to show signs of memory loss. For a good while, maybe 5 or 6 years into her 70s, this loss of memory was mild and to me and most of her grandchildren quite amusing. But as in many cases, over time, she lived a long life, dying at the age of 90, the symptoms became far more pronounced. Although she never got anywhere close to dementia, she was, by the final years of her life, impaired with respect to the kinds of short-term memory we all rely upon in order to negotiate the world. She would frequently, for example, forget where her spectacles were. Her solution to this was simply to wear whatever eyewear was closest to hand. She had tens of pairs of spectacles that had belonged to her long-dead brother and her then-living younger sister. When she remarked, as was often the case, that she could not see with the pair she was currently wearing, it did not occur to her that it was because the prescription was for her long-dead brother's vision. The second feature of what I assume to be a loss of memory can be illustrated by this second anecdote. When I first came to Cambridge and was in my early 20s, my grandmother by then would have been in her early 80s. Conversations with her took on the amusing form whereby she referred to me as David or Stephen. As you know, neither are my first name. They are, however, the names of two of my cousins, her grandchildren. In fact, we would hold long and affectionate conversations in the course of which she could refer to me by 4 or 5 different names, each belonging to one of her many grandchildren. But throughout the conversation, there was no doubt that she knew she was talking to me. I am her only grandchild to have gone to university, and much of our conversation was about that. What I want to draw from these examples is that perhaps it was not her memory as such that was beginning to have smaller range or less retentive power, although undoubtedly that too was a feature of her aging, but that she had lost some concepts. She had lost the concept of using a consistent name to refer to persons, or, in the case of her spectacles, she knew she needed them to see adequately, and she always reached for them when she got up in the morning. It's just that she had lost the conceptual machinery that enabled her to understand why she needed this pair rather than that pair. My point here, and I realise that this is anecdotal in format, my point is to establish a small but potentially powerful observation. What would the consequences be of our thinking about concepts, that is, understanding the concept of concept, if we were to derive a truth from describing my grandmother as having, in old age, lost some of her concepts? I'm going to begin again, now in a rather more rudimentary fashion, in a moment. But I want to draw out one final observation from this opening gambit before doing so. At first sight, it might appear that the two concepts I've suggested my grandmother lost in old age have different shapes or structures. In the first example, she knew perfectly well how to operate the concept of naming. It's just that she lacked the grammar whereby a name, if correctly applied, must be used consistently. In the second, she had lost something like a theory of vision, something that would have enabled her to understand she needed a specific pair of spectacles, not just spectacles, in order to see well. But when I put it like this, there is, as you can immediately recognise, an underlying conceptual architecture to both examples. What she had lost was something like singularity or specificity. I want to highlight this because it strikes to the heart of how I think about concepts. On the one hand, concepts, as I see them, have structure or form. Think of them as shapes or geometrical projections. Although it's far from easy to ascertain with anything like precision their elemental constituents, I believe that were we to make progress in this area, we would better understand why we come to understand, whatever it may be, that we understand. So this is to think conceptuality in terms of internal design, or with reference to the architectural elements that support specific conceptual forms. On the other hand, concepts are always connected through use with other concepts, and those uses can be parsed in order to ascertain the specific grammar that determines the sequence of conceptual connectivity. It might be helpful here to borrow a Wittgensteinian formulation that is going to be useful later in the Blue and Brown books. He writes, "It is part of the grammar of the word chair that this is what it is to sit on a chair." As will become clear, I see the grammar of conceptual forms as comprising more than a set of rules for the combination or configuration of an individual concept. It also includes how one inhabits or inserts oneself into a concept and its networks of usage. It has the sense of grammar as a way of life. What I mean by this can be illustrated in two ways. Let me take the formulation Simon gave me, understanding through concepts. What happens when we begin to alter the idiom, that is, a grammar of use here? What would open up or close down if we began to talk about understanding by or with concepts, or even without concepts? I grant that in these examples the length of movement away from the idiom where we started is hardly very far. Furthermore, the grammar here is easily accommodated to how we commonly think about understanding as arriving out of the application of tools or the result of some kind of reasoning or mental activity. In this scenario, there might be little to separate understanding through concepts from thinking through concepts. But once one notices this, the distance between thinking with concepts and thinking through concepts seems to be something one might want to attend to. And to make a bridge to Simon's talk this morning, what would the difference be if we were to think about understanding with things? In any case, we can begin to lengthen the stretch without much of a problem. Try this, understanding inside concepts, where the stress is on the procedures of understanding rather than what may or may not be internal to a conceptual form. This is meant to suggest that understanding might only take place inside conceptuality, rather than supposing that understanding might be enabled by, but also independent from concepts. Note, however, that once we begin to speculate along these lines, we kick into motion a set of assumptions about conceptuality itself. It supposes concepts to have interiors. It gives them a quasi or virtual spatiality. This leads to my second illustration. When I speak of the grammar of concepts, I do not mean to call to mind only the ways in which in English we use words, the grammars of their use. I also want to suggest that our lived experience is imbricated within our conceptual habitus, our habits of making sense, which also comprise a set of well and not so well worn paths in our cognitive processing. These routes or paths are what it is to live with a conceptual form. Such paths or routes can also be characterized as a set of links from one concept to another, thereby constructing a network within which a specific concept operates or is suspended. This last, suspended, is intended to indicate that all connections are not necessarily active at any one time. Those connections leave traces in how I use the language that is mine, but they also leave traces in the language at large. In other words, evidence for how one might live, and others may have lived, with a conceptual form can be gleaned from our cultural and social practices of communication, which of course, as we know, change over time. This is what I mean by saying that concepts are not only mental entities, they are also cultural entities. I realise that you're likely to be thinking that all this rather speculative talk about conceptual form needs to be anchored in a more specific starting point, something like a definition of the term concept. As anyone who has spent much time reading into the literature about concepts knows, this is far from an easy task. The term is used in a bewilderingly profligate manner in almost every discipline one can imagine, and frequently without much regard as to its differentiation from notion, idea, or even simply word or term. But since I've already indicated I mean to drive a wedge between word and concept, it's reasonable enough, I think, to ask for a clarification. So let me begin by stating that as I see it, there's more than one type of concept. Those that linguists and cognitive science write about are essentially labels or names for natural kinds. Like all concepts, they have a nominal function. It seems to me that this is true even for the kind of concept that some philosophers of language call evaluative concepts, those that have no separately graspable descriptive content. Humility would be an example. I'm not particularly concerned with so-called lexical concepts, nor with the function I call nominal. If that were my interest, one could easily collapse concept into word and simply speak of concepts as the meanings of the words that name them. I'm more interested in inquiring how certain kinds of concepts function in ways that lead us to feel and claim that we have arrived at more complex structured understanding. I'm tempted to temporalize this characterization and to speak of complex structured understanding events, because it preserves, even enhances the sense that understanding is always provisional, always sighted. It is understanding in this case. Here let me say something about the larger headline topic under which this occasion has been proposed: the location of knowledge. I take both the active and passive senses of this phrase to indicate something we ought to attend to more often than we do. The passive sense, that knowledge is always already located, you cannot recognize something as knowledge out with its placement within a terrain, this passive sense of knowledge being what is sometimes called context-bound, and often therefore damned as relativism, is familiar enough. But the active sense gives us rather more to think about. That is, the sense that knowledge is always going about its location. It is always searching for the location in which it can be taken to be knowledge. That sense, and the feel of provisionality it gives rise to, seems to me to require more attention than it commonly gets. It is why I want to speak of understanding in terms of our feeling that we arrive at a place, a location, call it knowing, where we sense we may pause, rest, reside, perhaps bide our time in being in that state of knowing. Perhaps I might tweak that a little. Perhaps I might now tweak the title a little to the location in knowledge. You can see in all this that I'm deliberately treading around, beating a path that negotiates the issue of propositionality. I'm going to do that because of this effort to think words and concepts as different entities. If we think of the location of knowledge and of the understanding that one might assume results from or is bounded by it in terms of propositional content, we will very quickly find ourselves conflating words and concepts. In holding them apart, I'm attempting to get a handle on how concepts function as signposts or relays in a process that I recognize as generating clarity, making sense of data or information that without the process or the conceptual architecture would remain unstructured. It's not the content of the clarity, as it were, that I want here, but the sensation of moving from one place to another, obscurity or cacophony to another, the clearing that Heidegger characterized as thinking. So to go back to my opening scenario, I mean to highlight this question: how does the concept of money work in terms of a set of structured mental operations, what I'm calling the movement of one thought to another, such that one understands what it is to buy something? This is not a simple question, given the difficulty of locating evidence of a kind that might be compelling with respect to the structured operations of the mind as it arrives at understanding. Just in case you are thinking, well, there's the technology of scanning the brain, let me note that as yet I see no grounds for finding such evidence compelling, which is to say that I doubt that we will ever be able to describe how we understand through concepts by reaching for scans and other technological apparatus which visualize for us the various electrochemical operations of the brain. But I shall be happy to be proved wrong on this. Let me try another definition. Perhaps the most succinct account I know of concepts that relates to how I'm asking you to consider them is to be found in the entry Christopher Peacock wrote for the Blackwell Companion to Epistemology. There he notes that concepts are ways of thinking. Note the plural here. Concepts are ways of thinking. This might be taken to indicate that each concept is a way of thinking. Cat is the way of thinking the animal we call a cat, dog a dog, and so on. But I prefer to read it more strenuously by noting that different types of concept provide us with different ways of thinking. Moreover, it might also be the case that a single concept may promote or propose more than one way of thinking. So here you can see that I'm thinking of a concept as if it were a set of instructions or a map that gives guidance as to how to move around in the processes and procedures of thinking. This is close to one of the more recent accounts of conceptuality proposed by cognitive science, the so-called theory theory, which sees concepts as theories. Such accounts, close as they are to my own, continue to see conceptual forms as exclusively mental entities. But if we take Peacock's ways in its most permissive guise, I think there is merit in working the idea that concepts might also have another habitus. A way of thinking, then, might be shared by others. Indeed, it might be a common and invariant feature of a language and culture that provides resources for understanding. Such ways are like pathways etched in the history of uses, praxis in the common, unshareable domain of our lived experience. Let me note in passing that it is not by accident, it seems to me, that walking seems to have a special affinity to understanding and thinking more generally. And of course, songlines are a good example of how such ways of thinking have cultural, social, economic, political, and historical extension. I now want to return to the issue of possession. From the perspective of concepts as cultural entities, I think it would immediately seem absurd to imagine that an abstract political concept such as freedom could be said to be mine in any strong sense. Although it may be considered to be within my toolbox if I use the term correctly, remember that's the diagnostic I'm trying to push over to one side, I may in fact only have a very weak sense of its meaning, yet still be able to make sense of a conversation about democracy. This is to say that if I were to be asked to supply a definition for the term freedom, I might find that quite difficult. It's also the case that I have no strong sense of a proprietorial grasp on this concept. I certainly do not consider myself to have discovered or invented it. On the contrary, I have in effect inherited it. It is part of the context in which I live and make sense of myself and the world. If it is possessed anywhere, it is in the sensus communis. Those pathways or routes toward understanding, then, are not only mine, not only a feature of my own cognitive processing, they are also held in common, in the common unshareable of cultural and social practice. If we begin to turn our attention towards the traces that are left in a culture's praxis, to the grammar of uses for specific concepts, we can identify the networks of connection that link one concept to another. That is, we can begin to see how the movement from one place of thinking to another was promoted or disabled by a set of structured relations between conceptual forms. These uses can be thought of as the traces of what it may have been to live with a concept. In conclusion, I'm going to return to my brief Understanding Through Concepts. The distinction between words and concepts I mentioned in my opening remarks is sometimes made by noting the difference between grasping a concept and knowing the meaning of a word, or using a word correctly, which amounts, of course, to the same thing. This distinction is upheld by Cora Diamond in a fascinating essay she published in 1988, which is really the prompt for these remarks. Her essay is entitled Losing Your Concepts. Although her essay is primarily interested in how moral philosophers are concerned in different ways with the loss of concepts, I take her comments to be applicable to the thought experiment with which I began. So I would now want to track back to the question I posed at my opening. What would it be to possess concepts such that one might be able to make sense of the thought that one could lose them? Would such a loss necessarily amount to a loss of understanding? We shall need a little more Cora Diamond in order to set up the context in which I want you to think about this. Diamond has some intriguing passages on the difference between understanding the concept human being in two ways. The first is to grasp its descriptive content. Seen this way, one can be said to possess the concept when one understands it to indicate a member of the biological species Homo sapiens. But seen another way, such an account fails to recognize the distinction between concepts, between the biological concept, this is Diamond, between the biological concept of human being and something else, as she writes. What it is to grasp the biological concept is nothing like what it is to grasp the concept of a human being. What you need to hear in this is nothing like what it is to grasp. Diamond wants to insist that in the case of the concept human being, we need to grasp more than its descriptive target. She writes, to have the concept of a human being is to know how thoughts and deeds and how happenings are met give shape to a human story. It is a knowledge of possibilities, their weight and mysteriousness. In other words, it is to recognize what living with the concept of human being entails. Diamond again. Life with the concept human being is very different from life with the concept member of the species Homo sapiens. To be able to use the concept human being is to be able to think about human life and what happens in it. It is not to be able to pick human beings out from other things or recommend that certain things be done to them or by them. And then she makes the point that will return us to the distinction between words and concepts. She says, to clear up a possible misconception, I am not saying that human being and member of the species Homo sapiens are terms which differ in sense. while the concepts have the same extension. My objection to what analytical philosophy does with the concept of human being is that it offers us a false idea of how concepts can differ from each other by abstracting from differences in what life with this concept rather than that is like. Understanding, in the way I've been encouraging you to see it, comprises not only applying tools, say arithmetic or ethical principles, or translating terms in the process of construal of a natural language. It also includes inhabiting a conceptual network whose pathways are etched by the history of uses that comprise it. Furthermore, there is more to understanding than its descriptive content. There's a felt relation to the sense of knowing that occurs when one states, "I understand X." This is what I've tried to convey by speaking of our understanding through concepts as living with conceptual forms. I cannot close without saying something about my opening and the thought experiment it presents. I wanted to attempt something very difficult, at least it seems so to me. I wanted you to get a sense of feeling thought moving from one place to another, of what it feels like to have followed a track or a path whose terminus or resting point you might not foresee. It seemed to me that narrative was going to be a very useful tool here. But it's not only that sense of being led somewhere in your thinking that I wanted to conjure up, howsoever clumsily. I also wanted you to try on the habit, familiar or strange, of the thought that concepts are not only mental entities, but also shared and simultaneously unshareable cultural forms. No one can think a thought for me, as Wittgenstein remarked, in the way that no one can don my hat for me. As is commonly the case with Wittgenstein, the strategy employed here is the decoy. It looks as if we're to attend in one direction or to one thing, say what it might be to think, when really that's just a decoy, so that we do not notice something else being smuggled in. Here in the Wittgenstein, it's in the way that, which itself, of course, has its own decoy, way. My version of that, I suppose, is what I call the conceptual fiction with which I began. If one were to know what it is to understand through concepts, one might need to consider that losing them is a way of forgetting how, and that one lives with them. Thank you.
Peter's wise and interesting explorations of the place and nature of conceptuality in the lives we live are a welcome corrective to some of the narrowing accounts of concepts to be found in the work of some philosophers and cognitive scientists. So I'll try and convey in a moment some of the things he finds wanting in this work are often only missing in explicit terms and can be assumed to be implicitly present in what many philosophers and even cognitive scientists have had to say. Even so, his own explicit elaborations of what needs to be said are instructive and have provided me a stimulus that will prompt me in the short time I have to suggest some ways of developing analogies and extensions of his remarks to themes other than his very interesting focus, which is the theme of losing our concepts in the process of human aging, and the question of what it must be to possess concepts and deploy them such that they might properly be describable as capable of being lost. The point of the telling anecdotal excursus in the paper one of Frederick Ernest and of his own grandmother is to suggest that some forms of lapse in the aged can be diagnosed as owing to the loss of concepts, the concept of money in the one case, and the loss of consistency in the use of proper names, as well as a loss of a certain specificity in the matter of her spectacles in the other case. One completely convincing path by which he steers us into seeing the importance of such a diagnosis is to be found in his acute observation that very often when we talk in simple and general ways of loss of memory in the aged, we may wish to add that a loss of concepts necessarily accompanies the loss of memory. He somewhere puts this point more strongly than it need be by saying that we conflate memory loss with conceptual loss, suggesting that what is thought to be one is really the other. It's perhaps more cautious to say that we often can't so much as understand what we mean by memory loss without seeing it as necessarily entaining conceptual loss. Thus, for instance, if I can't remember that I was in Hyderabad last winter, but I do remember that I visited my family home last winter, then that diminishes my concept of my family home, since it's presumably a central aspect of that concept that it was in Hyderabad. Something similar would hold if I'd lost my memory of being in my family home last winter while remembering that I was in Hyderabad, since it's presumably central to my concept of that city, that it was where my family home was. And the larger conclusion that he draws from this is that conceptuality has, therefore, to be understood in this mutually reinforcing, culturally holistic network of relations between particular concepts, revealing the larger context within which we, to use his words, live with the concept. In the passage of the argument by which he arrives at this conclusion, Peter contrasts his views with a more impoverished understanding of concepts to be found in the theoretical constructions of cognitive scientists and philosophers. And he does so by making two criticisms. First, a criticism of the idea that the possession of a concept consists in the mastery of the meaning and use of a word in a natural language, and essentially lexical mastery. Second, a criticism of the idea that to exercise concepts is primarily a mental process. Against the former idea, he notes quite simply that the loss of concepts, as in Frederick Ernest's loss of the concept of money, need not at all be accompanied by the loss of the use of the word money or its meaning. And against the latter, he leads us by accumulated steps to a well-motivated transition from Simon's commission of a paper on understanding through concepts to what his paper ends up being, one on that quite different subject of locution, living with concepts, and essentially a culturally embedded notion of concepts rather than one of a merely cognitive process. But here I wonder if there's not more scope to be ecumenical. Consider what it could possibly mean for Frederick Ernest to know the meaning of the word money while losing the concept. What is it exactly that he knows? Certainly he can articulate the phonetic vocable money or inscribe those letters of the alphabet on paper. But phonetic vocables and marks on paper are not yet words. Lexical entries in a dictionary tell you more than how to pronounce or inscribe the relevant term. But Peter's perhaps happy to allow more to Frederick Ernest, allow him, say, the ability to state the dictionary's semantic elaboration of the entry for the term. The point is, however, that when you lose concepts and retain this ability to state the meaning of a term, the ability you have is hardly more than the ability a parrot has, were it to state the meaning of a term. But it would be tendentious to think that philosophers and cognitive scientists had in mind to attribute that kind of ability to a possessor of a concept when they equated concepts with the meanings of words. They didn't have in mind merely that one can state the meaning of a word in the sense of mouthing the dictionary entry as even a parrot might, in the sense of, but they had in mind instead a range of recognitional capacities and other culturally constituted patterns of living a life with that concept that underlies such stating, and which makes it a genuinely case of stating, what J. Austin would call asserting as an elocutionary act. So though Peter's perfectly right to point out that what underlies lexical mastery is this richer cultural context for concepts, it's not as if philosophers and cognitive science would deny that that is so. They would merely think of that as the implicit elements that go into the mastery of the relevant word, whose explicit mastery comes out in the ability to state the meaning of the word. That stating would not properly be stating if that implicit mastery was not also possessed, no more than the vocalizations of a parrot would be stating. Now, no doubt cognitive scientists might put this point about the implicit mastery that underlies our lexical mastery in an idiom that is narrowing and even perhaps misleading, by saying that the implicit mastery is what operationalizes the simple act of stating dictionary definitions. That's cognitive science speech. So, but one shouldn't be put off by that alien idiom to thinking that it's necessarily tantamount to a denial of the richer cultural frameworking that Peter wishes to make explicit. So if I'm right about this, it's not as if philosophers or cognitive scientists would resist the framework in cultural field which allows one to say with Peter that to understand through concepts is really to live with concepts, but they would not make this point by drawing a strict contrast between a mental process and a larger cultural context, demanding as Peter does that one go beyond the former to the latter. They would rather insist that the latter constitutes the former. I actually think that one telling sort of symptom of this is that somebody like Chomsky, who has always been very modest about extending his views on syntax to semantics, does so for precisely this reason. That is, he's absolutely clear that concepts, when it comes to concepts as opposed to phonology and syntax, you can't have the kind of axiomatized, rule-governed theory that he has for syntax. I mean, there are philosophers who've tried to be more ambitious than him, but it's a measure of this man's modesty that he thinks semantics is beyond him, and for exactly the reasons that Peter wants to bring out in stressing the cultural context of the lexicon and concepts. And you know, Chomsky was the founder of cognitive science, along with George Miller and others. So, I want to quickly turn now to some possibly interesting extensions and analogies that Peter's cultural broadening of the notion of concepts brings to mind. His paper's dialectic proceeds from the diagnosis of a loss of concepts among the aged to the question, what is it to possess a concept such that we may lose it? And finally to an answer to that question, which insists that possessing a concept requires nothing less than to live with it in the broader cultural field in which it rests. That's the dialectic, that's how it goes. What I'd like to do is to start from the other end of this dialectic and ask, now that we've been alerted to the broader cultural field within which we live with concepts, are there other interesting ways of thinking of a loss of concept that has nothing to do with the lapses that come with aging? Suppose I lost a concept not by aging, but by going native in some alien culture. This would be a genuine case of losing a concept, but in some crucial ways it would be very different from losing a concept by aging, partly because one often would gain practical advantages by it rather than be landed with practical disadvantages, such as an empty refrigerator in Frederick Ernest's case, or not picking up the right spectacles, as in his grandmother's case. So imagine that I've come to the culture of North America from India, and over the years lost my concept of loyalty, and in its place acquired the concept of individual merit. This is just one crude example of the sort of conceptual loss and gain that going native might incur. The idea that one should recruit one's family members to a job, once considered by me to be natural and even virtuous, would now be dismissed by me with contempt with such terms as nepotism. And this is not, of course, just a switch in a single way of thinking of the world, whereby what was once considered an act of some sort of solidarity is now considered corrupt. But it hides whole ways of thinking of employment and what qualifies people for it, and what conception of human relations flow from it, and so on. All that goes with the loss of a certain concept of loyalty, the acquisition of a new concept, such as, say, individual merit, and it comes not with any practical disadvantages, as in Peter's protagonist, but possibly even practical gains, though also perhaps some forms of loss. An extension such as this of Peter's point about loss brings out vividly the norm-generating nature of the cultural field within which one's understanding through a concept amounts to a living with it and its entire cultural constitution. Part of the point of declaring that a concept we live with gives us whole ways of thinking, pathways, etc., is to provide a normative backdrop within which we think and correct ourselves if we are out of step. When I first went to America and to university there, I didn't have the concept of something which I frequently heard about on the lips of friends. They would constantly call various people nerds. Lacking the concept, I would go back home and worry, I wonder if I'm a nerd. When I fully acquired the concept, I must have tried, probably unsuccessfully, to trim my behavior and lifestyle to the cultural context of my companions, for whom the concept carried much opprobrium. This is the normative power of concepts, once one fully understands the kind of point that Peter wants to make about the cultural entities that they are. But now, if that is so, it may also be worth considering the idea of losing concepts in a sense that is more deliberate than in Peter's anecdotal examples. At one point he talks about wishing, which is, I think, what I'm wanting to push, but push along particular lines. This is the possibility that one might lose a concept willfully as a form of resistance to the governing normative orthodoxies that current concepts may impose on one, given their cultural embedding. Thus, for instance, Joan of Arc, a mystic poet, resolutely refused the legal concepts under which she was tried, as did Oscar Wilde, who famously said that obscenity was not a concept with which he lived anymore, and it did not provide him with a way of thinking of the world anymore. It is conceivable that they both might have once had these concepts, that they were now deliberately disavowing them, shedding or losing them in a quite different sense than, say, Frederick Ernest, in the oppressive legal context which they were resisting. And the point of significance here is not that Wilde was merely resisting the views of his legal prosecutors, but he was declaring the loss of a concept, and in his case a cultivated loss of it, and thereby resisting a much larger cultural framework than he could possibly do if he just disagreed with their views. This suggests in turn a converse relation from the one that Peter stresses, that concepts and words may bear to the normative and cultural field within which they are exercised by individual minds. As I said, he's right to suggest that concepts are not just individual mental processes functioning in the normative and cultural void, but rather individual mentation is itself constituted by the cultural field under which it's undergone. But then a question arises about the extent to which an individual's concept, say of money or spectacles, may deviate from the force field of the cultural framework within which it's lived by that individual. And from this further questions may flow about the extent to which innovations in the cultural field may come from the idiolectical and idiosyncratic deployment of concepts, suggesting, the example would be when Peter's grandmother says, Stephen, she literally means Peter, my grandson. I mean, that's literally what Stephen on her lips means. That's idiolectical. That's the idiosyncratic thing. That's an uninteresting example. If this was true of concepts which had greater reverberations, this might be the kind of basis for conceptual innovation and cultural innovation. So, for instance, the larger question here is the extent to which innovations in the cultural field may come from these idiosyncratic deployment of concepts, suggesting the following possibility. Might it even be that certain forms of loss of concepts, whether as a result of aging or not, may lead to conceptual and linguistic innovation, and in its way, even cultural innovations, given Peter's embedding of it in the culture? I don't have the time to develop this thought, and I'm sorry to leave you with a very cryptically made analogy, but just consider Mrs. Malaprop's effects on language. And then consider analogous and possibly more substantial forms of innovation that conceptual loss might sometimes effect in the culture that makes possible the concepts we live with. We lose concepts, and in doing so we use words in idiosyncratic ways, in more substantial analogues or versions of malapropisms. These have the effect of linguistic innovations leading to conceptual and cultural transformations. To put the point in another way, it is said that sign languages, in small but nevertheless marked ways, equip those with loss of vocalizing powers with some more subtle, innovative, gestural forms of communication that are unavailable to those with vocalizing powers. What I'm asking is there a conceptual analog to this? That is, an analog to this among those who have lost not vocalizing powers but lost some concepts. I don't think we should rule out the possibility that this sort of loss, because of the idiosyncratic conceptual deployment that it can generate, may introduce innovations into the linguistic and cultural field that Peter thinks is the essential backdrop to living with concepts.